Well, welcome again to Is Genesis History Student Educators Conference. And I'm Dr. Boyd. And I have a PhD in Hebraic and Cognate Studies from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. And I have been looking at studying the flood narrative for 11 years in detail. And I'll be sharing some of that with you this afternoon. But what I would like to do now is, I've been talking about a kind of a sequence of things. And I want to write this on the board. Is that okay? Okay. We've been talking about Genesis as history. Okay. Let me say historical. Okay. Literary. And theological, okay? And we haven't done a lot with this, theological. And so what I want to do is kind of give you an introduction to a very big field, and that is Old Testament theology. I've taught Old Testament theology for a number of years at the Master's College, and there's two basic ways of teaching Old Testament theology. You can teach Old Testament theology presenting your own Old Testament theology, what you think it is. And there were professors at the college and many other colleges who think that's the best way to do it. But the Old Testament theology has undergone such a I would say I won't say confusing, but an elaborate, complicated history of development that I didn't think that was really doing the students justice. They needed to experience what has happened. And Old Testament theology is, in a sense, is a laboratory and also a reflection of what happens to various different disciplines as they are infected, and I'm using that word deliberately, infected by the conventional paradigm. The conventional paradigm, when we understand what that means, know that there's no supernatural, God doesn't speak, God doesn't intervene. And what happens, I mean, in fact, I wondered to myself, how can you do theology at all, if you don't believe in the supernatural, okay? If you don't believe that God that God has spoken. I mean, what is theology then? Okay? And it's amazing what these brilliant, mostly German theologians, Old Testament theologians, biblical theologians, what they came up with in order to do theology. Now, so what I want to move on here is just, again, to say this is just an introduction to Old Testament theology. Now, these are some observations. Down in the corner, you can see just some names of these biblical books, and things got thrown around for some reason. Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning. By the way, I don't know whether you know this or not, but in the Hebrew Bible, the names of the books come from the first word of the book. So the first word of the book is Bereshit, in the beginning. And so, so when you refer to Genesis, they say Bereshit, and usually they'll just have a bait and then a resh. It'll be abbreviated. Exodus is Shemot. Shemot means names. Okay, why? Because that's the way Exodus begins. These are the names of the sons of Jacob and so forth. Leviticus, the Hebrew for that is Yikra. He summoned. Okay, Numbers is Bamidbar. Numbers points to the name Numbers points to the two censuses that were taken. Bamidbar is where the book of Numbers transpires, where all the events transpires. It's in the wilderness. Okay, Midbar, that doesn't exactly mean wilderness. It really means where the animals are driven, where you can graze the animals. You find the animals over in the ancient, in the Near East, the sheep and goats. I mean, they can graze on barely anything. And so, but that's what the wilderness is. There's another Hebrew word, the yeshimot, which is the total desolate wilderness, the kind of stuff you find as you're driving across California and approaching Needles. That's the Yeshimon, kind of thing. This just means where the animals are driven in order to graze. Deuteronomy, which means second law, okay? The Hebrew davarim, it means words, okay? These are the words. So that's where these names come from. Now here's some observations. In general about this portion of Scripture, which we've all been looking at, whether we're geologists, biologists, geneticists, paleontologists, and Bible guys, we've been looking at this, and I just thought it would be good, kind of as a review, just to look at this. This section of the Bible is familiar to most people, wouldn't you say? Right? This section of the Bible is familiar to most people. They know about these stories. They know about. You ask an American, how does the Bible begin? Oh, it begins with the creation. In the beginning, almost anyone can tell you exactly how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. They all know that. They probably know if they know anything about the Bible, they'll know that. Okay. They'll also know the Lord is my shepherd. I don't know if they'll know much more than that. They might know a little bit more. Okay. They might know John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But they'll know Genesis 1:1. They probably will know Psalm 23:1, and they'll probably know John 3:16. So this section of the Bible is familiar to most people. Okay, they also know about the flood. They've heard about it. The section of the Bible is examined in the courts. Now that's an amazing thing. This is the only section of the Bible that has been examined in the courts. U.S. courts have actually considered whether this section of the Bible should be taught in schools. And this is amazing. Yeah, I'm going to go on. I was going to say, I've actually had a family experience with this very early on, where my father challenged someone who said there should not be Bible reading in schools. My father challenged this, and it ended up going then finally to the courts, and they said, well, there should not be Bible reading in schools. That's a violation of separation of church and state. But my father did the right thing, and he was, greatest generation, landed on the beach at Normandy, and so he wasn't afraid of anybody. German machine gun shooting down. So he didn't care. He would talk to the judges and everything, and he came in on the second day, not the first day, at Normandy. Nevertheless, those guys were made of pretty stern stuff. So he challenged, and it ended up going to the courts, and the courts said, and also recently there's been cases where it's come back to the courts again, and it probably will again. But isn't it amazing that this section of the Bible has been examined in the courts? This section of the Bible has inspired painters, sculptors, and filmmakers. Most recently, this is interesting because I did this slide years ago. Filmmakers. Most recently, Thomas Purifoy and Compass Cinema, and that's why we're here. But this section of the Bible has inspired painters. You look at the great paintings. I've got the sculpture there of Michelangelo of Moses. And there are wonderful, of course, his paintings of the creation of man on the Sistine Chapel is one of the world's greatest paintings. And so painters, sculptors, and filmmakers. This section of the Bible divides Christians. Let's just be honest. Okay, it does. There are those who are old earth, and those who are young earth. So we're divided on this. We're still Christians, though. The section of the Bible is a continental divide of biblical studies. There's no question about that. Because there are issues here, that has impacted Old Testament theology. I'll come back to that. This section of the Bible appears to contain parallels to ancient Near Eastern texts, and that's very interesting too. In 1859, as you know, Darwin published his Origin of the Species. And at the same time, that was the very year that Akkadian was finally deciphered. And so, which opened up the world. Up before that time, all we had were classical sources, Latin and Greek sources, to know what the ancient Near East was like outside of Israel. Okay, all we had was the Bible, the Old Testament, and we had Greek and Latin sources. Well, in 1859, that all changed. Okay, and we began to decipher Akkadian, Egyptian, and Sumerian, ancient Elamite. All these languages began to be deciphered, and a little bit before that was Old Persian. All these languages we began to then gain a window into the ancient Near East. And we found these parallel texts. And the issue is, what do you do with them? And I showed you yesterday how I believe that Moses and others were aware of these texts, and they wrote in such a way as to attack what those other texts were saying. They used them, and the fact that they knew their readers, their original 15th century readers, knew those texts in order to make some tremendous theological points. Now, here we go. This section of the Bible is a problem to many Old Testament theologians and historians. As a matter of fact, it's such a problem that most Old Testament theologies that are recognized to be the top Old Testament theology, which unfortunately they do not include any evangelical Old Testament theology. They don't consider us to be worthy. And maybe it's because we haven't written in German. I don't know. But as I said, most of them are written in German. And so the Old Testament theologians, what do? Since this section is a problem, Genesis 1 through 11, they say, well, guess what we're going to do? We are going to start Old Testament theology in Genesis 12. We're going to start with Abraham. We're not going to really worry too much about Genesis 1 through 11. That's in a different category. And by the way, there are the so-called black sheep of Old Testament theologies. If you work out your Old Testament theology, you're going to ultimately have to deal with Genesis 1 through 11. You're going to have to deal with the wisdom literature. Okay, how does the wisdom literature fit in? How does the Psalms fit in? Frankly, how does the Song of Solomon fit in? How does that fit in to Old Testament theology? Those are issues. But this section here, 1 through 11, Genesis 1 through 11, is definitely a problem to many Old Testament theologians and historians. And as I say, as a result, they don't really deal with it, and they jump to the chapter 12. Now, there is an Old Testament theologian who was he's a very good Old Testament theologian. He's rather old now, Elmer Martins. And he's written a number of editions of his Old Testament theology. And in the last edition, he wrote, he admitted he added a chapter, and he said, I could have started my maybe I should have started my Old Testament theology with Genesis 1. And I'm going, yay! Finally, somebody was willing to start Old Testament theology where God starts it, which is Genesis 1:1. So, anyway, this is a problem to many Old Testament theologians and historians, and therefore, they basically tend to skip over it. This section of the Bible is yet foundational for understanding the rest of the Bible. You really can't do Old Testament theology. You really can't understand the Bible without, first of all, understanding that God is the creator. When God gives his own personal argument to Israel to prove that he is the only God, and this argument is found in Isaiah 40 through 48, he offers 2 points, okay? 2 evidences. Number one, that he is the creator. Over and over again it says in those verses that he's the creator. And then secondly, what does it say? He says, I also determine and know the future. And the high point of that is in is in Isaiah 44:28, where he says, I'm going to tell you, when I say I know the future, I am going to predict, I'm going to tell you who is the name of the king who will repatriate the nation after this nation goes into exile because that nation is involved in idolatry. You're going to go into exile, but there's the nation, the king is going to repatriate the nation. His name is Cyrus. And he told, and we find that in Isaiah 200 years before the repatriation. Okay? And it's repeated again in Isaiah 45, 1 and 2. Now this, you see, now in a sense, God has gone out on a limb and said, I'm going to tell you the name of that king. And lo and behold, who was the king who repatriated the nation? Surprise, no surprise, I should say. It was Cyrus. Repatriated the nation. Now, of course, what liberals say is the future is unknowable. Not even God knows the future. And therefore, that section of the Bible, starting 40 through 66, Isaiah 40 through 66, must have been written after the fact, even though it's presented as if it happened before the fact. In other words, it would be kind of a pious forgery. That's the whole origin of the idea we might have heard of Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah. It comes from a way of explaining God's prediction of the name of the king who will repatriate the nation after the exile. So this section of the Bible is foundation for understanding the rest of the Bible. You must understand that God is the creator. And not just the creator, but he's also the uncreator of the world at the flood. Okay, let's continue. Some questions to frame our study. How do we go from a description of content to a delineation of theology? We have narratives, as you know, Genesis 1 through 11, with tiny little poetic snippets here and there for emphasis, but it's mostly narrative. And so how do we go to description of content to a delineation of theology? These are just some questions for thinking about. Why are matters of authorship, composition, and date not arcane and peripheral, but germane and trenchant? Why are those things important? Because when an author wrote and to whom he's writing is very important for understanding the text. For instance, if you think Daniel was written in the Maccabean period, your understanding of the book of Daniel is going to be very different, and the circumstances are very different than if you understand it was written in the 6th century, which is when it was written. Okay, so matters of authorship, composition, and date are very important. And we can't go into all of that, but I'm just saying that that's what I'm saying. Old Testament biblical theology is a very involved thing. It involves many, many things. What is the value of considering the historical, geographical, literary, cultural, and religious context of this section of the Bible? Well, that's what this conference is all about. This is very valuable. This is, again, I go back to the idea in Isaiah 40 through 48. What does God consider the most important thing to tell the nation about himself, to prove that he is God? Only the true God can create, and only the true God can know and determine the future. So, okay. Oh, and by the way, in that second one, knowing and determining the future, tied up with that is the whole concept of predicting and determining that the servant Messiah will come and save his people from their sins. So in that section, Isaiah 40 through 48, we have Isaiah 42, the first of the servant songs of Isaiah, Isaiah 49, okay, is a little bit outside that, and then 54 through 11, and of course then we have 52, 13 through 53, 12. So, but it begins in that section. God says, I'm going to do something new. I am going to save people from their sins, not by some kind of a great military deliverance or something like that, but it's going to be this servant who's going to suffer and pay and take the burden and take this penalty of the sins on himself. And that's the way you're going to be healed. That's all part of it. Fourth, how should we approach and understand this section of the Bible? Well, that's an obvious question. How should we do it? Well, historically and literary, and then that leads to the theological. What is the significance of so-called parallel accounts of creation and the flood in ancient Near Egyptian sources and of ancient Near Eastern law codes predating the Mosaic? Well, actually, I'm going to be writing an article on this for CRS about the creation and the flood and in the ancient Near Eastern sources. So I'm going to really getting into this. So I'm not going to be talking about this much now, but you can see, I gave you some examples yesterday of some of the wording from Atrahasis, and I told you about also Numa Elish, how different that is from the we find in Genesis. And it seems that it's not the parallels so much as the differences. It's a polemic. The readers are aware of it. The authors of these are aware of it. Both the human author and the Holy Spirit are aware. And therefore, it is part and parcel of reading the text. That we know that these creation and flood epics existed, and Egyptian sources also have similar things. And this is the way it works. That we read the text with this understanding that the readers knew about this, and so did the authors, and took advantage of it. Why has this section of the Bible fomented so much controversy? Isn't that what this is all about, right? It's fomented so much controversy because, as I outlined a couple of days ago, the Bible was attacked. The authority of the Scripture was undermined, and particularly in two places, in the early chapters of Genesis and in the Gospels, okay? Those things were attacked, and what that did was it allowed then, okay, it's like prying open a door. Now it allows other ideas, godless ideas, to come in, and they eventually took over, okay? They eventually took over, and now they won't allow the truth back in, okay? Matter of fact, there was I think he was a biologist, I think it was at Harvard, his name is Lewontin, and he says, we dare not let a supernatural foot back in the door, okay? You know, even if evolution, you know, if we have no evidence for it, and it turns out the thing is all blown apart, we dare not let something back, we dare not let a supernatural foot back in the door. Well, that's, so, efforts to try to get that foot back in the door, we're going to be attacked. And I don't know whether you followed it or not, but on Facebook is Genesis History. You can read some of the negative comments. There's not all positive comments about the movie. I'm sure the same thing is going to happen with this. A lot of comments are going to come out which are negative, like, oh, that guy, you know. That guy Boyd, he doesn't know anything. You know, he just went to seminary or something like that, and he's just making things up about Hebrew and all. No, you know, that's the kind of stuff that will come out. Or Snelling, you know, there's two Snellings out there. I've seen that idea. Steve Austin, they'll attack him. They attack us because we're trying to get the divine foot back in the door. Okay, and the movie has done a lot to pry open that door again and try to get it back in. But let's be honest, we are an extreme minority. How do we garner legitimate lessons from the lives of the dominant personalities found in this section of the Bible? The issue here is, how should we approach the Scriptures? Do we look at them as, do we understand them as saying, this is what God is saying about himself and about his people and historically? Or do we look at the Scriptures as, what does this mean to me? And I think we first need to understand what it's actually saying before we apply it. And so there are issues here. There were, in medieval times, various different approaches to Scripture. And so we have to move on. Now, how do we go from a description of content to a delineation of theology? We already talked about that. Okay, you determine the author's purpose for writing. Why did the author write this? You know, why did Moses write the creation account? Was it just simply to tell us how God created, or was it also to attack the other views? And I think you can tell by the very careful wording and distribution and the literary structure that there's more involved. Determine the author's purpose in light of the historical, geographical, literary, cultural, religious context of his time. Determine the significance of the atypical aspects of a text in light of the typical. Now this takes a lot of work, because you've got to know what's typical. I mean, that's what you usually find. You have to read a lot, right? You got to read a lot and say, okay, this is what we usually find. And then when the atypical comes, man, it just jumps out at you, okay? And the atypical can be in terms of sound. It can be in terms of morphology. It can be in terms of syntax, all kinds of things. In light of the typical characteristics and content of other biblical texts in ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian texts. Determine the genre of the text. You don't want to interpret poetry like narrative. You don't want to interpret narrative as poetry. Now, this is an interesting one here at the bottom. Determine the relative coverage of text to time. Now, Genesis 1 through 11 covers a lot of years, okay? 11 chapters on that, on thousands and thousands of years of time, you know. Who knows how many years. Let's say just for the sake of argument, let's say the creation is in 10,000 BC, okay? Well, when was Abraham born? 2167. So we're talking roughly 8,000 years, 11 chapters for 8,000 years. Now, we have 39 chapters for, what, 300 years? So, although we recognize that Genesis 1 through 11 is extremely important and foundational, the distribution, the amount of material that is used to cover only 300 years suggests that that's maybe even more important, because it's talking about the covenant relationship. And I taught a course in Master of Arts in Biblical Studies at the Master's College. In fact, I developed the curriculum for it. And the Master of Arts Biblical Studies, one of the courses is called Creation and Covenant. And those are the two, they're the ways of looking really at the entire Bible. And actually, you can actually summarize it all in terms of covenant. I mean, excuse me, all in terms of creation, because God creates at the beginning of time. And what does he do at the end of time? He creates again. It creates a new heaven, a new earth. And what is in the middle, of course, is Christ's and in his interview with Nicodemus. And how does he present salvation? As birth, as a recreation. So we have creation, 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 and creation imbues the whole Scripture. So, determine the relative coverage of text to time, yes, but understand that's one of the factors in determining the emphasis. These are some technical things. Determine lexical frequency profiles. What you can actually do is you can use a computer program and determine lexical frequencies. How many times a particular word occurs, and in Hebrew, how many times a particular root occurs, and print it out in order of frequency. I highly recommend doing that. You can see a lot that way. Determine the significance of the selection of the material or of structure of situation descriptions. Thematic threads, things that go through books and so forth. Determine the significance of historical allusions. Okay? So in the flood account, the third fixed date that's given is when the dry lands, when the mountaintops appear. Well, what is that allusion? That's an allusion back to the third day of creation, when God said, let the waters which are under the heavens gather together into one place in order that the dry land might appear. So this is an allusion back to that. And so what we see is the flood is an uncreation of the world and then a recreation of the world. You pick that up from that allusion in Genesis, from the flood back to creation. There are also places where the narrator will explain things to us, gives explanations and comments. Sometimes frame breaking of the narrator and the Lord. He will actually turn away from his narrative, and he'll say, particularly the frame breaking occurs. This is he addresses the reader directly and says, "You can see that until this day." I talked about that yesterday. Ad hayom hazeh. Determining the semantic structure of the text, macro, micro level, macro level, mega level. This is the book. The ideas of finding how sequences are determined. It's a little technical. Determine the realization of expectations developed in the text. These are all different theological procedures that can be used. And then I gave him a little quiz, which I don't have time to give you, since this was a course. Because I wanted to find out how familiar it really was to people. And anyway, let me just move on here. I have this little quiz. Now, Old Testament theology. First of all, let me just say this. Biblical theology is different from systematic theology. That's a very important thing that you need to know. Okay? Systematic theology should be built on biblical theology. Okay? Not the other way around. Some efforts at a definition, an attempt to do Old Testament theology. These are listed here. Dicta probantia. This was the idea that they had certain categories. That they say, okay, I want to know what it has to say about God, about the Holy Spirit, about the earth, about man. Certain categories that come from outside the text, and then you look for what the Bible has to say about each of those things, okay? That's called dicta probantia. That's not a good way to do it, okay? Old Testament theology must be done in such a way that the categories come from the text. You don't impose categories from outside on the text. You let the text determine the categories. Okay, the second thing here is a German term, Heilsgeschichte versus Histoire, which is a French word. Heilsgeschichte is holy history. That means that what we have here is a tendentious narrative. It has a very particular propagandist perspective. Unfortunately, also involved in this term is the idea that it's not real history. This is just holy history. This is just a kind of a perspective on history. It really didn't happen this way. Religionsgeschichte, that has to do with the history of religion. And Traditionsgeschichte, the history of Israel. Now, what I'm showing you here is this development that because of the anti-supernatural ideas, that the scripture, the Old Testament theology, eventually almost died. It was almost destroyed. These are just efforts of definition. Elmer Martin's The Goals for Old Testament Theology says that they're separate disciplines. It must be historical. It must relate to the New Testament. It is descriptive and normative, meaning this is confessional. This is theology. This is what we believe. This isn't just some kind of thing we step back and look at objectively. This is our faith. Okay? Look down at the bottom under methods. Diachronic or synchronic, centered or not, scientific or artistic. Diachronic means through time. Old Testament theology, biblical theology, whether it be Old Testament or New Testament theology, it is diachronic. That means you are looking at God revealing himself through time. Okay? There was this also, not synchronic means looking at it as a whole. Systematic theology tends to look at theology as a whole. What does the whole Bible say about this subject, about whatever happens to be? God's saving grace, God's characteristics, and you look at the whole Bible, what the whole Bible has to say about this. Diachronic means you look at how God has revealed it through time. Another issue is whether it's centered or not. Is there a central theme that ties it all together? And some theologians say, yeah, we can find a central theme. Others say, no, we can't. Also, in determining the theology, it is not, you can just, if you do this, this, and this, and this, you're going to get it. There also is a kind of an artistic aspect of this, which means you have to understand the material very well in order to see some of these points. Just wanted to mention here, these are 4 things that John Sailhamer, who is an Old Testament theologian, he is a evangelical but not as conservative, and nobody could ever pin him down on Mosaic authorship and other issues. These are the 4 things: text versus event. And the issue is, where is revelation? Is revelation in text? Did God reveal himself in text? Is the Bible a revelation of God? Or is the revelation in the event, God revealing himself to Israel, to his people? Well, I would say it's both, okay? But John Sailhamer would say it's just text, and therefore, when something happened, when the Exodus was, and who wrote the Pentateuch is not an issue. Canon versus criticism. Canon has the idea that this is a confessional issue. Criticism, higher criticism, tearing the Bible apart and looking for the sources and so forth, whereas canon looks at it as a whole. I could say more about this, but I need to move on. Confession versus description. It's not just a description, some objective of description, but it's our confession, it's our belief. Diachronic versus synchronic. We've already talked about that. So those are some important issues that we're going to be looking at. Defining Old Testament theology, preliminary definitions. And here's one by Gerhardus Voss. By the way, I had my students write a definition at the beginning of the class, what they thought. I had them read a couple of articles, and I said, okay, now write a definition of Old Testament theology. Then at the end of the class, I said this. I told them then at the beginning, I said, and your final exam will be exactly the same. You will write a definition of Old Testament theology after we've had this whole course and see if it's changed. Okay, and it better have. So to exhibit organic growth or development of the truths of special revelation from the primitive development, from the primitive pre-redemptive special revelation given in Eden to the close of the New Testament canon. That's Gerhardus Voss. Very good. Evangelical. Stendhal is a liberal, but he's a brilliant Old Testament theologian. I put those together. It's difficult, but the task of biblical studies, even of biblical theology, is described to relive and relate in the terms and the presuppositions of the period of the text what they meant to their authors and contemporaries. See, what he's saying is it only matters what it meant to them, okay, not what it means to us. That's one of the problems with Stendhal, but it talks about the text as is and as was. Remember this? It's up there, okay? Historical events portrayed literarily to communicate a theological message. This is very important. History and literature, theology. Now, toward a definition. You always have to ask the question then, what is the locus of revelation? Event only, text only, reading only. Remember, because we have the reader and event and text. We can have all these different questions. We can't go over them all. Did God reveal himself gradually in event? Did God reveal himself gradually in text? Well, actually, it's in both. Also, we have another thing that's going on here. Okay, we have a developing canon. Books are being added. Okay? When Moses brought the children of Israel out, or I should say, just about when they're about to go into the land of Canaan, He had completed the Pentateuch. Well, Isaiah hadn't been written yet, okay? But by the time we get to Jeremiah's day, all those books had been written in between. And so now Isaiah has been written. And you understand then we have a developing canon. So that's another thing that's going on here. God reveals himself in completed canon, but it's experienced gradually. There's various different ideas. There are various different questions concerning author. These all pertain to that little diagram of author, event, reader, and text. There are questions that come from each of those four. And so what are the interactions among author, event, text, and reader? What is the focus on the event, focus on author, focus on text? And these things can happen, but particularly in poetry. Poetry draws its attention to itself because of the way it's written. Also, poetry tends to be emotional. Therefore, we get a sense of the author's feeling about something. So, focus on event, author, text, and reader. These are different questions we should ask. Now, I do want to go over these incorrect inferences with you because it's important that you realize these are wrong. Okay? Remember those four things. Excuse me, three things: historical, literary, theological. You will find people who will say theological content precludes historical reliability. That is the liberal position. They're saying if you say it's theological, okay, then automatically it's tendentious, it's propaganda, and of course, if it's theological, it's got that word theology in that word God in there. We don't believe in the supernatural, okay, miracles and so forth and so on. And if you're talking about things that God did, such as creating or bringing the flood or raising the dead, well, that can't be historical, right? It can't be historical. But that is an incorrect inference. To say that theological content precludes historical reliability is an incorrect inference. It's an incorrect dichotomy. Theological content precludes artistic portrayal. You'll find people who say, if it's theological, well, then it cannot be literary, because the literary, that's the artistic aspect of things, right? And these two can't go together. Well, I'm here to tell you, they certainly do, and the artistic portrayal, that literary portrayal, has a lot to do with bringing out the theology. Artistic portrayal precludes historical reliability, okay? If something is highly literary, and when human beings write something that's highly literary, they have a hard time dealing with making it also being also something historical. Historical things tend to be, kind of dry. I mean, there are some exceptions, obviously. Milton talking about the fall, but he does add an awful lot in Paradise Lost to the simple text in Genesis 3. So when you make it this great literary composition, Paradise Lost, there's things that are stretched here, okay? Not so with the Bible. The Bible being a supernatural document. God is able to have these three things together and not contradict one another. Artistic portrayal precludes theological content. Go the other way around. Now, if it's artistic, it can't be theological. Well, why not? Matter of fact, I maintain that that's the way that theology comes out. Historical reliability precludes theological content. If it's historical, then it can't be theological. Okay? As history is defined according to rationalism, the Enlightenment, but the whole thing. And then, of course, historical reliability precludes artistic portrayal. In other words, these are all the six things. They are, what we turn out is they're all incorrect inferences. They're all incorrect dichotomies. That the reality, the interesting interface, is the author's artistically portrays an historical event to communicate a theological message. Now, I'm here to tell you, and I'll be doing this afternoon, that sometimes it makes it very difficult as a result because there's such a drive to communicate the theological message, it's very difficult to get to very specific aspects of the historical event that were not clearly meant to be communicated, okay? In my research, we're looking at the internal chronology of the flood. Well, that was not Moses' purpose. His purpose was not to communicate the internal chronology of the flood. His purpose was to communicate that God was protecting Noah and destroying the rest because of their sin. And as a result, what is the center of the text? The center of the flood account is Genesis 8:1. And it's very easy then to conclude, well, then that must be the center of the flood. Okay? And I thought that for many years until I started looking really carefully at the text and said, whoa, wait a minute, there's a problem here. Okay? The Hebrew doesn't support that. So, this whole idea, the author artistically portrays a historical event to communicate a theological message, is the, as I said, that is what we always have to be considering. Questions concerning the reader. Again, the whole series of questions then concern the reader. Now, in order to be accurately to understand a text then, we have to get as close as possible as readers to the original readers, don't we? Okay? We have to understand as much as they understood. Is it possible we can understand everything? I don't know. See, here's one of the problems. I asked Dr. Stephen Lieberman at Dropsy College when I began my doctoral program. I began it at Dropsy and then finished it after we had 1 year at Dropsy and then finished it at Hebrew Union College 7 years later. And I said, Dr. Lieberman, in your opinion, he was this kind of short but very large man. And I asked him a question. I said, in your opinion, Dr. Lieberman, how much material have we been able to unearth? And he had this foible, which I think was his brain engaging. He would go, and he'd make that sound, okay? And then he would say, then he would come out with this absolutely brilliant statement. But in this case, he said, about 0.1%. I said, do you mean there's 99% still in the ground? He says, oh, yes. And I'm thinking, whoo. And those readers, you see, they knew about the 99%. In all of the subsequent years, it's been buried and so forth. And we need people like Doug, okay, to dig it out, to find it. But you've got a lot of material to work with, Doug. There's a lot there for you to still work with. 99% or more, maybe 99.9, okay? But questions concerning the reader. We have to get as close as possible to the original readers. Questions concerning canon. By the way, which canon should we follow? Should we follow the Masoretic text? Should we follow the Septuagint? I like the Masoretic text myself, and we don't have time to talk about those issues here. What is the interaction between progressive revelation and a completed canon? God revealed himself to his people progressively, but look what we've got. We've got the completed canon. Now, isn't that interesting? We have a finished Bible, okay, and yet he revealed himself progressively. How do we handle that? Okay, now look what this. Again, some couple of incorrect inferences. A diachronic approach precludes canonical analysis. If we look at God's revealing himself diachronically, that would somehow preclude that we can look at the development of the canon, and vice versa. A canonical approach precludes a diachronic analysis. Reverend Childs, a liberal by any definition, was actually, I think he was the head theologian at Yale. He's passed away. Said, hey, you know, what we need to do is, as theologians, we need to develop our theology from the completed canon. That is the canon that the church has accepted. Now, does he believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch or Isaiah is a unity? No, not at all. okay? But he's still saying that the community of faith has said this is the canon. So we need to analyze the completed canon. And, I just went, yay, okay? Finally, you're going to look at the completed canon and the guns these guys have, okay, to train on the text, as I said, are much bigger than ours. Much, much bigger. And so now they're doing close readings of the text and putting behind them, most of them putting behind them that source criticism and all that stuff and saying, let's just look at the text that is there. And what a wonderful advancement that was. I'm going to have to move on here. This is all discussion of all these different contexts. I just kind of touched on them. And what I'm going to do here is I think I'm going to go directly to essential elements of Old Testament theology. I call these the 12 commandments or prohibitions of Old Testament theology. And of course, it's going to come in a weird order. That's okay. The first commandment, ta-da, the first commandment. It must derive its categories, themes, motifs, and concepts from the text. Okay? It must not impose them on the text from outside the text. Now, by the way, I need to tell you right now that I am following an approach of the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, which had these positive statements, okay, of affirmation followed by a denial. And I said, boy, I really like that. I'm going to borrow that, okay, for Old Testament theology. It must derive its categories, themes, motifs, and concepts from the text. It must not impose them on the text from outside the text. Fair enough. It must consider the historical development and the progressive nature of revelation. It must not treat the text as a monolithic, static whole. Okay? God progressively revealed himself. It must be built on real history. It must not be built on a reconstructed pseudo-history. Now, there's a reason for this one, and that is, by the time we get to the 20th century, Old Testament theology had almost been destroyed, as I said. It was brought back by two German Old Testament theologians. One, Walter Eichrodt, who suggested a center of covenant, of the eruption of God's kingdom on the earth. That was, he suggested this tied all of Old Testament together. And with that, it was written in the 1930s, okay, before World War II and between the wars. And it kind of resurrected Old Testament theology. It was going over the brink because there were those saying it's not history. What's talking about is not history. They would say, and the theology is just propaganda. So Old Testament theology was going out, and Eichrodt basically brought it back. Well, Eichrodt, however, did not consider historical development. He only had this idea of a center that tied everything together. Okay? So, in the 1950s, Gerhard von Rad, another Old Testament theologian, said, we must have a historical development. All right? However, this is wild, okay? Okay, we can't accept the history that we see in the Old Testament. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to reconstruct a pseudo-history and have our theology follow that. So he basically made up a history of what Israel's confession of God developed through time. And there are places in which he has brilliant observations, but other times he's just like going off into space, okay? So he was criticized by his colleagues who said, well, no, Gerhard, you don't believe it's historical. And yet you have this historical kind of thing, you know. Nevertheless, those two books, one, the idea of the center, and secondly, the idea of that this is something that must trace through history, brought Old Testament theology back from the brink. Number 4, it must admit the supernatural. This idea that theology cannot admit the supernatural, that's just nuts. I mean, let's just say it, okay? How can you have a theology? God is supernatural. It must admit the supernatural. It must not exclude the supernatural based on analogies to current ontology or epistemology, okay? Let's continue. Okay, it must recognize the excitement, uniqueness, and excellence of the Old Testament text and its witness to God's relationship to Israel against the background of the boring sameness and mediocrity of the ancient Near Eastern religious texts as an independent polemic against them. Okay, I said it. The ancient Near Eastern religious texts are boring, same, vanilla, okay, compared to the Old Testament texts. There's no comparison between them. It must not see the text as a dependent parallel account. Unfortunately, in biblical studies, most biblical studies, they see the ancient Near Eastern texts in such a way that Israel is borrowing from them, as if Israel cannot develop anything on its own. And as some kind of a dependent parallel account. Remember, the emphasis is on the differences, not the similarities. Number 6, it must take into consideration cause and effect and the interrelationship of theological themes. It must not treat themes in isolation from one another or from historical events. In other words, everything is interrelated. You're not doing proper theology unless you are connecting things together. It must consider the literary aspects of the text. It must not ignore them, consider them as irrelevant or counterproductive. You'll see that this afternoon. It's been a battle, but you actually can use the literary aspects of the text to determine some of the requirements for a geological model of the flood. And I shared these things with Dr. Snelling and Dr. Wise and others, and I said that we can't argue this. You're going to have to fit these into your model. But boy, it was hard to do that. As I said, the text was meant to communicate theology, but you cannot ignore the literary aspects of the text. The literary structures. I have one of the guys I'm mentoring, who's in my project. His assignment is to study the literary structures of the flood account, and then we edit his work. But it is that's one of the very important things, and I'm going over it. I've been studying it for 11 years, and I have my text printed up, the Hebrew text printed up. And then I've colorized it, and it's got so much stuff on it you can hardly see the text anymore. Okay? Number 8, it must summarize and explain the themes of each book and the blocks of writing. It must not consider any book in isolation from the rest. Okay? These books are not in isolation, and they must be considered. You can't leave out a book. You can't leave out Song of Solomon and say, well, I don't know how it's going to fit in. You got to fit it in. Okay? Otherwise, it's not Old Testament theology. Okay? It must follow the order in which the books were written. It must not follow an order imposed upon it from outside. Okay? What I'm saying here is this whole idea that the Torah is late because monotheism is late. This is an idea of the evolution of religion. Monotheism is late, polytheism is early, and therefore Johann Fatke said, we need to turn the Old Testament upside down. obviously the Torah is the product of the Hebrew state, not the basis of the Hebrew state. You see, that is he has imposed that order from outside. Okay? It must elucidate themes that span books and blocks of material. It must not exclude any books. And it must begin with the beginning. It's amazing. I had students write little essays in the course, and so one of them was, what is the significance of beginning your Old Testament theology with Genesis 1:1 versus beginning it with Genesis 12:1, okay, with Abraham? How would that change your Old Testament theology? And it must not begin with a point determined by a preconceived idea. And number 12, very important, it must relate the Old Testament to the New Testament. It must not be secessionist or supplantive. Okay? You can't look at the Old Testament by itself. It's obvious that its completion and fulfillment is in the New Testament. And this is the reason why you will find very, very few Jewish Old Testament theologians. They're as rare as hen's teeth. They really are. And there are even Old Testament theologians, there are even Old Testament scholars, Jewish Old Testament scholars who will say, I am going to do Old Testament theology using the Jewish literature, the post-Christian literature, the Talmud and so forth, as the fulfillment. And then there'll be another Old Testament scholar saying, you can't do that. Okay? Mattiyahu Tzavat said, you can't do that. This great Jewish Old Testament scholar, Tzavat, said, it's obvious that the Old Testament is meant to be fulfilled in something he wouldn't want to say in the New Testament. But it's not fulfilled in the Jewish literature. Okay, so you must tie the Old Testament to the New Testament. I wish I had time to go over the history with you, but I'm just going to point to one person, one name at the bottom here. Johann Gabler. Like the turkey. Okay. Johann Gabler. All right? Now, what did Gabler do? At his inaugural lecture, okay, at the University of Altdorf, this is something you should remember, 1787, March 30th, is when Old Testament theology took a path of its own away from systematic theology. Now, you might probably disagree with almost everything that Gabler said in that lecture. But what he did say, which was important, is that that's the biblical theology, because he talked about old and new. Biblical theology must take a different path. It must understand the idea of progressive revelation. It must take its themes and its ideas from the text and not impose them from outside. Johann Gabler, Altdorf, 1787, the same year that the Constitution in September 17th was approved. In 1787, March 30th, Old Testament theology was set on the course that it's on today. And any kind of Old Testament theology has to be now, no one would even think of imposing categories from outside. It has to come from inside. All these other names you've seen before, Pereira, Spinoza, all kinds of crazy ideas out there. But that is the ideas. And of course, here's the two big guns again. Oh, I didn't mention them. Just closing thoughts. The devastating effects of rationalism and Enlightenment thought. We're seeing that. That's what is Genesis history is answering, okay, in a positive way. But there was devastating effects of rationalism and Enlightenment thought on the understanding of the Old Testament. and till it was brought to the brink of extinction. And then finally, the 20th century, the Restoration, the two big guns, these two Old Testament theologians, these two Germans, Eichrodt and von Rad, brought it back because they said we must consider the center, and we must consider progressive revelation. Now this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at the literary approach to the flood narrative, and also how we can derive very specific geological conclusions, I believe, from the flood narrative. So thank you for your time.